it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for your next PB&J card class, and today I'm using some new stamps from their new collection, Happy Everything. I've got Poppy Time and also Twirls, and I will be making a mixed media card. I really love with these large scale stamps that you can do mixed media on canvases or you can do them on cards. So today we're doing a card, and here's a peek at what we'll be creating. So because I'm going to be adding a lot of water to this, I'm using watercolor paper. And I'm going to start with Faber-Castell Design Memory Craft Gelatos, and the colors I'm using are metallic mint. That's the color I'm coloring with now. And then I'm adding snow cone, and then I'll also add pistachio. And I'm coloring pretty heavily onto the paper, just kind of mixing those colors together. And right now it doesn't look like much, but I'm going to add water and blend these out and kind of lighten this background. So you can see now I'm going to take just a paintbrush with some water and paint over this and letting the colors mix and blend. This is really a base layer, so it doesn't need to be perfect. You can do it with water. You can also take a baby wipe if you want to lighten it up. That lightened it up a little bit more, so I'm just using the gelato that's left on the paintbrush. And now I'm actually going to take that gelato and put it onto the wet paper and blend it with my finger. And that gives me just a little bit more control. I can darken and lighten up areas using the same colors that I used the first time I colored onto the paper. And just blending that in until I'm happy with the effect. I don't want this too dark because I'm going to be putting a lot of layers on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and dry that before we move on to the next step. So now I've got my stamp Twirls. This is a really nice stamp for sort of backgrounds on your mixed media if you're doing sort of floral images. I'm coloring this with a Stampers Big Brush marker. Now this is India ink, so once it's dry it's going to be permanent. I misted the stamp and my paper, so I'm stamping wet into wet, and that's what gives it that nice watercolor look in the background. And this color marker I'm using is Cobalt Blue 143. And again, misted the stamp and my paper was still wet, but I did mist it a little bit more. You can see the watercolor effect you get there. Now I'm going to let that dry. And now I'm taking my stamp Poppy Time, and I'm going to stamp this with archival black ink. I want a permanent ink when I stamp this so it doesn't run when I add water for one of my following steps. So I'm going to stamp this right onto my watercolor paper. And then I'm also going to stamp this a second time, and I'm just stamping this onto Nina Tiara White cardstock. I don't want to use a real thick watercolor paper on this. I don't need to because I'm going to be coloring it in later with markers, and I'm going to cut it out and layer it onto my background. So I want to work a little bit more on this background. I want to make sure that black ink is completely dry before I add any more layers. And when I do this next step, I don't like to have to worry about staying in the lines or out of the lines on the flower. That's why I stamped it a second time, and you'll see me color that and cut it out separately. So these are Art Grip Aquarelle watercolor pencils, and I'm using them to color around the image just to give it a shadow and also some extra texture, because when I add water to this, I'm going to let it puddle up, and it really just adds to the watercolor mixed media artsy look. I'm using 3 different shades. They're numbered at the top. It's 154, 144, and 168. So a blue, a turquoise, and a green. And now I'm adding water to that. And I'm kind of just using a lot of water, tapping it. You'll see me tap it sometimes with my finger. And I'm first doing all the turquoise, then I'll move into the green and then do the darker blue last. But I'm kind of working in from the area that isn't colored and working up to the colored area. That kind of lets the water bleed that color out if it's bleeding out into an area that's already wet. And I do not want a perfect look on this. I really like that painterly, puddled look. And you can see I didn't have to worry about going onto the flower with the blue because I'm going to do that later. Here I just colored onto a scratch piece of cardstock, added water, and picking it up with the paintbrush and tapping and flicking it onto the piece just to give it some splotches. And I'm adding a little bit of extra blue to that corner. So you can use these directly the pencils directly onto your piece, or you can do it on a separate piece of cardstock and pick up the color like you're creating your own palette. Now this is the second flower that I stamped, and I'm using my Stampers Big Brush markers to color. So this first color was Pink Madder Lake 129, and now I'm adding Magenta 133, coloring in small sections and then blending with my fingertip as I go. I'm going to go back with that original color and just add a few layers over the top. And I love when you do this, you see some brush strokes and it looks almost like it's painted, but you have a lot of control with the markers. So I did that up there on the top of the flower, and now I'll get the buds with the green. They're pretty small, so I just did the darker green and then the lighter green, and then a touch of pink on that top one. And then I'm also going to use this green to color in the stem on the flower. And since there are so many layers, the gelatos, the watercolor pencils, and we're working on watercolor paper, I can color that on and then blend it with my finger, and it blends very easily. Excuse my head there. I'm adding a little extra down here at the bottom. Again, keeping that painterly look going. Now I wanted to add some lightness, some white areas to the background, so I'm taking the coconut gelato, coloring it directly onto my cardstock and blending it with my finger. And I think it's amazing the lightness that that touch of white can bring to the project. I just think it gives dimension and keeps you having areas of light and dark on that background. So I cut out my pieces that I had colored on my second piece of cardstock, cut them out, and now I'm gluing them onto the original piece. And if you wanted to color it directly on the background, you could. I just chose not to because I don't like worrying about staying in the lines when I add that additional color around the edges, like the blue there along the bottom of the poppy. I'll turn to the back and trim off the excess. And here's a closer look at that card. To finish it off, I just added some washi tape and a sentiment and mounted it onto a white note card. Thank you so much for watching. For details and more information, visit the Penny Black website, www.pennyblackink.com. And at the end of the video, I have a list of all the supplies used.